Hello everybody and welcome to a complete breakdown of my Dual Strike Antiquarian in the Phrecia League. We'll be going over practically every component of how this build functions, so if you're looking for a much more concise explanation, check the Path of Building link in the description below. And don't forget about that handy dandy notes tab. Otherwise, let's begin here, starting with the overall concept of the build. We're turning a mechanic called Ward from a normally defensive mechanic to instead an offensive one. This occurs through three main means: the Antiquarian Ascendancy class, the Yenda's Stand unique belt, and the Night Grip unique gloves. For our Ascendancy, the Caligaran armor node helps generate our baseline ward value by converting the armor and evasion from our body armor into instead ward, and then the Starlight Reflector node doubles the overall ward's value. We then snag an additional 10% defenses with each of Antiquarian's small nodes for a grand total of 140% increased ward. This is then where our gear comes into play, the aforementioned unique items and obviously our body armor. For the body, getting as high rolls as possible for both armor and evasion is key, as both of those stats are used to determine the ward value. It's important to note that global modifiers to armor and evasion, such as from the passive tree or from flasks like the granite or jade, will not be converted into ward. We only care about the local value on the body armor itself. Then, using the Yenda's Stand belt, we reach 100% total conversion to ward. Remember that our Ascendancy class gave us the other 50%. And fun fact, we can actually reach 110% total conversion by catalyzing the belt up to 60%.
Hey, I don't know, man. I don't make the rules, don't ask me, bro.
But why do we even care about ward in the first place? Didn't you say that it was a defensive?
Well, yes, but actually no. Enter Night Grip.
Yeah, okay, but just how much offense do those really get?
Oh, my hot diggity dog.
Yeah, sorry. When I said an offensive layer earlier, I actually meant the offensive layer. Whoops, sorry. My bad. Thanks to our good pal Night Grip, we gain 10% of our total ward as chaos damage. And another fun fact, this chaos damage is global and is applied to every ability that you use. Attack or spell, Night Grip don't care. So, to sum everything up thus far, we choose the Antiquarian Ascendancy class because of its ward scaling capabilities, then acquire a high armor evasion body armor and pair it with the Yenda's Stand belt to get that total ward value as high as possible, and then use Night Grip to gain 10% of our ward as global chaos damage. Now, one thing I haven't covered yet is what ward actually does. Well, it's basically a barrier for our health against one single hit. Unlike Energy Shield, which can be partially depleted, ward will fully break after any hit, but then also fully recover after normally 2 seconds. But for us Antiquarians, 1 second. So we have a big pool against a singular hit every second. Cool. Unfortunately, however, we can't fully utilize ward's defensive potential due to Night Grip, which causes 75% of damage to bypass ward and go straight through to our health. What this means is that ward still does act as a barrier, just now it only applies to 25% of the incoming damage instead of all of it. You can think of the net result of this interaction as Night Grip turning your ward into 25% less damage taken every couple of seconds, instead of basically being immune to the next hit every couple of seconds. And remember, it's every 1 second for Antiquarians. So, a pretty sizable downgrade, but still an effective defensive layer, all things considered. However, this downgrade is well worth the trade-off of, again, a fat chunk of global chaos damage. Therefore, all that's left now is to, well, choose what to actually do with all of that chaos damage. For me, a tried and true melee enthusiast, Dual Strike of Ambidexterity was the all too obvious answer. Dual Strike of Ambi has a rather unique form of scaling damage, particularly the line uses offhand weapon attack time. This line essentially nullifies the need for attack speed on your main weapon, letting you focus on as much raw damage as possible, and turns your offhand into a fast attacking stat stick. Therefore, in our offhand, we opt for an Imperial Claw with its life per hit implicit plus high attack speed. And for our main hand, there really isn't any other choice here aside from Paradoxica. And Frostbreath, if you're on a budget, again, check the POB in the description below for details. The reason is because normal weapons generate damage via their flat values, but for us, remember, we already have a gargantuan amount of flat damage from Night Grip. So, Paradoxica doubling that flat damage simply cannot be beaten. However, note that Paradoxica says attacks with this weapon deal double damage, and not simply attacks deal double damage. This is because Dual Strike will sum the two individual damage values from each of your weapons while dual wielding to generate the final total value that goes to the enemy. All this means is that we don't entirely double the damage of each dual strike, rather just the portion dealt individually by Paradoxica. But hey, that's why we're running a Dual Strike of Ambidexterity. 70% more damage with your main hand weapon means 70% more flat chaos damage, which is then also doubled from Paradoxica. This equates to Paradoxica having 3.4 times more damage than our offhand claw, which also means that, hey, our claw isn't just here to attack fast, he's
helping out the best he can with a teensy little bit of damage.
Another cool thing about Paradoxica is that it doesn't just come with the double damage line, it also has 2 random veiled mods. Veiled mods are exclusive to the betrayal mechanic and provide some interesting stats. Here, we're looking for Chaos Pen and Crit Chance. Penetration is used in practically every build that doesn't deal pure physical damage, which is like 99% of the builds out there, due to, well, monsters having resistances. If something mitigates 40% of your damage, it would be wise to try and unmitigate that, right? And another fun fact here, resistance penetration can go into negative values with a hard cap at negative 200% or, just dealing triple damage. And it's actually much more than triple your overall damage when you pin something down to negative 200% because their starting resistances are above 0. Penetration is good. Like the mechanic of penetrating enemy resistances in the hit online video game known as Path of Exile, that's good. And also penetrating your and Crit Chance is, well, Crit Chance. Not really. Remember earlier when I talked about local versus global stuff? Yeah, well, same thing here. The increased critical strike chance on a weapon applies to its base critical strike value, meaning that mod essentially multiplies your overall crit chance. While the same increased critical strike chance on the passive tree, for example, is actually a global modifier whose increase applies to your weapon or spell's base value. You can easily see this interaction reflected in game by taking any weapon without the crit chance mod on it, looking at the base crit value, then rolling that increased crit mod and looking at that base again. Notice that the number itself changes. Then, if you grab some crit nodes on the tree, that number on the weapon stays exactly the same. Local versus global. And another fun fact, this is exactly why plus crit chance is so valuable. That form of crit adds to your base value, essentially making it a multiplier to your overall crit chance. Say, for example, you have a base of 8% crit chance, but also have a 200% increased crit chance for the passive tree and whatnot. This would make your final total crit chance 24%. 8% the base times 3 the global increase of 200%. Then say you manage to grab plus 2% crit chance. This applies to your base of 8%, not that final result of 24%, which would bring your base up to 10%, which is then again increased by your global 200% up to a total of 30% crit chance. So just by grabbing a seemingly inconspicuous plus 2% crit chance, we brought our new final crit value up to 30% from the original of 24. That's 25% more crit. Do you see the power? Anyway, where was I going with that? I guess I was like trying to teach you guys something. I don't know, man. I just work here. Ward stacking, chaos damage, dual strike of ambidexterity. Boom! That's it. That's the build. Rather than going over every other component of this build in the same fashion, we would be here for quite a while longer. Instead, I'll hop in the game and go over the rest of things piece by piece. Again, check out the path of building in the description below for a more concise overview if that's what you're looking for. Otherwise, check out my stream at twitch.tv/Woolie Gaming. And for the rest of you, let's go over the rest of the build now.
All right, here we are in the game. I will start with breaking down every single skill and support gems, then I'll break down my gear, and then I'll end with the passive tree. So starting with our main links, obviously it is dual strike of ambidexterity. Getting 20% quality on dual strike of ambi is extremely important because as you can see, it says 70% more damage with a main hand weapon. If you hold the alt key, if you did not know, you can hold the alt key to see more information on pretty much anything when you hold it down. Normally, this skill only has 50%, so getting an extra 20% is gargantuan. So definitely get 20% quality on this as soon as possible. Then for support links, I'm using increased critical strikes. I can also use increased critical damage here. However, my crit chance is not super high right now. So this is probably roughly the same damage as increased crit damage support would be. Regardless, you want one of the two. Then we're using Void Manipulation because obviously we're doing a bunch of chaos due to Night Grip, so 34% more is huge, and we're not dealing elemental in the first place, so that's literally no downside. Ruthless support here is pretty good when paired with multi-strike support, so I guess I'll talk about this first. So supported skills repeat 2 additional times. You'll see I'll click one single time here. 1, 2, 3. So that's what the 2 repeats mean. And then the 44% more melee attack speed simply means, you get those repeats out a little bit faster. You'd be like slugging away, taking 2 seconds to do the entire animation if it did not have that 44% more attack speed. So that's good. Overall, multi-strike and anything that can use it is almost always the answer because you'll see here my mana cost. I have 70 total mana. I attack. You see it only goes down 1 singular time. So my dual strike currently costs 25 mana. That is only being deducted from my pool for the initial multi-strike use, not any of the repeats. So it cuts down on your mana cost and it increases your damage and the overall like quality of life feeling with the more attack speed. So all in all, multi-strike is extremely good. And then it's especially good when paired with ruthless support. Every third attack with your melee skills deals 98% more damage. This is roughly a 33% more damage multiplier if you think about it. And again, we're attacking 3 times with one button press, so every single time we press, that final attack right there is getting basically a double damage. Very good. And then for the final link here, I am choosing to run Fortify. Fortify is a mechanic that simply gives you 1% less damage taken from hits per stack of Fortify, up to 20% normally. So I get 20% less damage taken, and then I also get 19% more damage with Dual Strike. You can also get fortification from various other sources, such as the passive tree. However, and we'll talk about that when we get to the passive tree, your skill points are extremely valuable. They literally get exponentially more useful for your character the higher your level is, and I'm currently sitting at level 97. So saving the passive points from the tree and just using Fortify as a support link turns out to be more efficient for me. Now let's talk about what I'm doing to support Dual Strike's damage. First of which is we're using Assassin's Mark. This is a curse. Curses are extremely powerful mechanics, but normally your character can only apply one at a time on a given enemy. We'll talk about how we're getting around that in just 1 second. So Assassin's Mark, you can see right there, hits against cursed enemies have plus 1.5% to critical strike chance. If you remember earlier in the video, I talked about how plus % crit chance is entirely different from something that says increased % critical strike chance. Plus is adding to your base value. You can see here my Paradoxica's critical strike chance is 8.45%. So by adding 1.5% to that, we're essentially going from 8.5 to 10% critical strike chance, which is then going to be scaled by all of our other % increases on the passive tree and such. So very powerful. On top of that, we have plus 49% to critical strike multiplier, so we get more damage. The life and mana per killed is pretty much irrelevant. It's kind of nice occasionally, but that final line again is due to the 20% quality effect. Cursed enemies have a 5% chance to grant a power charge when hit. Power charges give you 50% crit chance per power charge, with your character having a base maximum of 3 power charges. So all in all, we get flat or base crit from Assassin's Mark, crit damage, life and mana per kill, and 150% increased critical strike chance. Goes without saying, Assassin's Mark is huge for crit builds. Supporting it, we have Mark on Hit. This is just for automation purposes. There's no way I'm going to be manually casting Assassin's Mark every time I see an enemy that needs to have it. So Mark on Hit simply means that whenever we're hitting something with an attack, we're applying Assassin's Mark to it. Obviously, the automation has to come with some sort of a downside, so we have 16% reduced effect of the mark, but that is a more than worthwhile trade-off for automation purposes. And then finally, Life Tap support. So if I didn't have this socketed, you would see here that the mana cost of my Assassin's Mark is 52 mana. Again, my total mana pool is 70. Slight problem there. So we're simply using Life Tap here. It does have a 300% cost and reservation multiplier, which means that that 52 mana is now sitting at 198 life. Quite a big difference. But look at our life pool. We have 4,659. I think spending 200 of it is just fine, especially considering the life per enemy killed of Assassin's Mark itself, and then our life on hit from our claw and our instant leech from our passive tree, etc. So the life cost is completely negligible, all things considered, whereas the 50 mana would be absolutely unsustainable. Furthermore, I'm running 2 additional curses here, and the way I'm doing that is from the Anathema ring, but I'll talk about that when I get there. Just know that my max curse limit on this character is 3 instead of 1. So for another curse, we have Despair. Cursed enemies have minus chaos resistance. I talked about earlier in the video. Again, penetrating resistances, same thing as lowering them here in this case. It's just absurdly powerful. Also, enemies have way less chaos resistance than elemental resistances, so minus 30 to chaos resistance is a huge chunk of damage. Then I'm also running Enfeeble, which has cursed, rare, and unique enemies. Those are the scary ones. Normal and magic, they can sometimes kind of be scary, especially the magic ones, but for the most part, it's rare and unique enemies that you need to worry about. Deal 18% less damage, which, as you can imagine, is extremely powerful. And then these guys are also linked to Life Tap, again, for the same reason. Now, for these, you may be wondering, well, you don't have anything linked for automation purposes. And that is because this claw here, that final line, says trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill with an 8-second cooldown. I'll explain this more in depth once we get to the gear section, but all you need to know is that these are automated because of the claw that they're socketed in. Then another huge component of our single target damage here is Withering Step. This says it's a travel skill. It's not really a travel skill. All you need to know is that it provides us a temporary buff like that, and as soon as I use any skill, bam, it'll consume the buff, and then anything inside of this area, it says here, gain 8 withered debuffs. Withered causes enemies to take 6% increased chaos damage per stack. So the enemy is taking 48% increased chaos damage, which is a separate multiplier to all of our damage, which remember, we're dealing pretty much entirely chaos damage. So this thing more or less gives us 48% more damage. absolutely disgusting. And you can see here, it is a 3-second cooldown of the skill, and the withered debuff from the skill lasts 3 seconds. Furthermore, we have it linked to more duration, so the more skill effect duration simply applies to that withered duration. So in reality, we have withered lasting, 4.6 seconds, something like that, whereas the cooldown of this ability is 3 seconds. So we have a little bit of wiggle room to keep applying the withered. The only downside here is that we can't actually get up to the maximum of 15 withered debuffs on the enemy. I mean, we technically can, but in reality, when you're attacking something that is going to need multiple casts of Withering Step, spoiler alert, most things don't need it because they die in the first few seconds anyway, but we're fighting a pinnacle boss like Shaper or the Maven, for example, that extra 1.5 second wiggle room, because remember, the withered does last longer than the cooldown of the ability. We're going to spend that time, maneuvering around the boss, dodging an ability or whatnot. So in reality, we're going to have 8 stacks of withered whenever we're hitting an enemy, but I guess technically we could get up to 15%, which is, a whole butt ton more damage. Finally, the last support gem for offensive purposes is Blood Rage. This is used in every single melee attack build out there, not even melee, just any attack-based build should be using Blood Rage, because at the very least, you can see that line right there, grants 15% increased attack speed, and this is a 10.8 second duration ability, so you literally just press the Blood Rage key, see the buff up here, and you get, 15% attack speed for free, basically. You also get frenzy charges on kill. Frenzy charges are very powerful, such as power charges. Frenzy charges give you 4% more damage, 4% attack, 4% cast speed per stack. So while mapping, we get 15% attack speed, but then we also get 12% more damage and an additional 12% attack speed on top of that. So Blood Rage is very, 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 very good. The 4% of your maximum life taken per second as physical damage is pretty much negligible, because you're going to have regen, you're going to have leech, more importantly, and you can even mitigate that from things such as this body armor. It says 3% additional physical damage reduction that will apply to the DOT of Blood Rage. So basically no downsides for an absolutely gargantuan upside. Speaking of defenses, however, let's talk about our defensive links. The first, again, was Enfeeble. This is essentially, we just take 18% less damage, pretty juicy. Then for our 2 auras, we're running Determination and Grace. The reason we're running these is because of our Ascendancy class, the Antiquarian, giving us global defenses. So the auras themselves give you a little bit of flat defense, as you see here. Determination gives you 1,000 flat armor, then 49% more. Grace gives you 1,500 flat evasion plus 29% more, but then these values are going to get scaled by the Antiquarian global defenses. You see my armor in hideout is 4,000 and my evasion is 11,200. If I pop a jade and a granite flask respectively, boom, you see they go up to 11.6 armor and almost 20k evasion. Quite the sizable amount. And a fun fact here, the estimated physical damage reduction, there's a reason why it says estimated here. There is no way that you are taking 53% or whatever your percent is less physical damage universally in all cases. That is not how it works. And that is because the amount of mitigation you get is proportional to the incoming damage. So this flat armor value is weighed against whatever the incoming damage is. The general rule of thumb is that if you want to take 50% damage, which is basically what I have right here, from the incoming hit, you need 5 times more armor than the value. So, for example, I have 4,659 health. Let's say something is coming in for 5,000 damage, pretty much will one-shot me. Well, if I want to reduce that by 50%, I would need 25,000 armor. Even with my granite flask up, I am not even halfway there. So just keep that in mind. Whatever this percent physical damage reduction says here is not what you're actually going to have. However, again, like on the body armor, this 3% additional physical damage reduction, that does work exactly how you would expect. Whatever mitigation you get from your armor, any additional physical damage reduction, that's why it says the word additional, will be applied after the fact, which is a good segue into our next defensive layer, Enduring Cry. Now, the buff of the Cry itself is pretty garbage. 2% of life regen per second is pretty much useless, but the grants 1 endurance charge per 5 power to you and allied players. That's why we're using it. Endurance charges over here, you can see I have one. Players gain additional physical and elemental damage reduction for each endurance charge. They give you 4% per charge, again up to a normal maximum of 3 charges. So by pressing this button 1 time on a boss, which the power mechanic simply means the harder the enemy, the more charges you're going to get when you pop it. So all this means is that when you press the Enduring Cry button on a boss like this, you're going to generate your max endurance charges, and then you get 4% physical and elemental damage reduction per charge. It is extremely powerful. Pretty much every build should try and use endurance charges as a defensive layer. Then we have this linked to Urgent Orders for 69% increased Warcry speed. See here, if I don't have that, it basically looks exactly the same, but I guarantee you while you're mapping and running around, you will absolutely notice the downtime if you do not have something like Urgent Orders socketed with the speed. And then the final skill gem for defense here is Molten Shell. This thing is linked to cast when damage taken for automation purposes, and Molten Shell essentially just gives you an extra buffer to your HP whenever this thing procs. paradox. Cool thing about castman damage taken is that it says when you take a total of 3,272 damage from hits. However, this is a pool that is constantly being added to. It's not like you have to take a singular hit of 3,272 damage, then it procs Molten Shell. It'll just keep accumulating, and then eventually you'll just pop Molten Shell for some extra defenses. It's hard to describe exactly how much defense this gives you while mapping, but if I had to guess, the uptime is about 50 to 60%, and while it's up, it probably gives me a grand total of like 25% more defenses, something like that. And then for our movement skills here, we simply are using Whirling Blades linked with faster attacks, so it looks something like this. Whirling Blades is a very powerful movement skill. This and Shield Charge are definitely my two favorite. Fun fact here with Whirling Blades, actually the farther away your mouse is from your character, so if I put it right here, you can see that I'm Whirling Blades pretty fast. If I put it all the way out here, you can see it takes much longer to recover. So it's more efficient to keep your mouse as close as possible to your character while moving around. Then for Frostblink, every single build in the game should have some sort of, ledge traversal ability, something that can bridge gaps. Frostblink is by far the most common movement skill because it is an instant blink to a different location. It creates chilled ground when you use it, which slows the action speed of enemies, and it has very fast cooldown recovery time because you can see the line here, 99% increased cooldown recovery rate for each rare or unique enemy in the area, and then 19 for each normal and magic. So basically, you blink into a pack of monsters, you start attacking, you basically just attack once with this build, they die, and you can just Frostblink to the next pack over and over and over. And you can actually chain your Whirling Blades with your Frostblink, looking something like this, just to get some extra movement speed as well. All right, that's it for the skill gems. Let's move over to our gear, starting with our weapons. The Paradoxica, as I talked about in the video, double damage with attacks from specifically the Paradoxica, and then the two veiled mods are going to be Chaos Penetration and Critical Strike Chance. The Strength and Intelligence actually have no use for us. I'll explain that when we get to the passive tree. Then for our other weapon, we're using an Imperial Claw. That is because it has the highest life per hit implicit modifier there, plus a very high attack speed value. The only mods we really need here are the % increased attack speed, the global critical strike multiplier, and then that crafted suffix modifier, trigger a socketed spell. The 8-second cooldown there does not apply globally, so both of these have to share it. They are individual. So both Despair and Enfeeble can cast simultaneously, and then they both have a separate 8% cooldown recovery time that you have to wait for. But as you can see here, the duration of both of these is 11.8 seconds, so they have permanent uptime on any boss that we're fighting. Then the body armor here, obviously we're looking for as high armor and evasion rating as possible, because this is what generates our ward. You can see here, I have 16,899 ward. If I take this off, I now have 288. Let's go, baby. So quite the sizable difference there, no? So the armor and evasion modifiers are going to take up your prefixes. Therefore, for your suffix, you're looking for stuff like resistances, additional physical damage reduction, and spell suppression. Then the implicits here, you see it has an Eater of Worlds and a Searing Exarch implicit. As you progress through the endgame, you'll encounter these enemies and the currency that they drop to apply to your items. The 10% of physical damage from hits taken as cold damage is very, very powerful. Any source of phys taken as is always going to be mandatory for builds, as long as it exists in Path of Exile, quite frankly, simply because this is essentially saying you're taking 10% less physical damage. It is far easier to mitigate elemental damage due to your resistances. They start at 75%. You can get +1 max, such as, our other modifier here, the Searing Exarch, +1 all maximum resistances. It is far easier to mitigate elemental and chaos damage than it is physical. Therefore, taking Phys as an element or even as chaos is a wise idea. Also, speaking of maximum resistances, so again, the normal maximum is 75%. So +1, now we're at 76%. However, if you take, let's say, 100 incoming damage, if you're at 75% resistances, 100 turns into 25 damage, right? Well, if you get +1 max, now you're at 76% resist, 100 damage turns into 24 damage, not 25, but the difference between 24 and 25 is 4%. So by getting +1 max res, you're taking actually 4% less damage. And this discrepancy actually grows the more maximum resistances you get. You can see here that it says maximum resistances cannot be raised above 90%. I think the math, if you go from, 89% maximum fire res to 90% max fire res, you're actually taking, I think, 10% less fire damage just by doing that. Obviously, it's very hard to get up to 90% of a maximum resistance, but just thought I would let you know it's a very, 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 very powerful stat for your overall defense. So our body armor is especially important, again, because of its interaction with our ward, which remember, our ward is essentially our offense. You can see here that we have 70,000 chaos damage. That's all thanks to our body armor. Then for unique items, we're running the Night Grip. These things have a corrupted implicit of +1 max frenzy charges, so instead of 3, now I have 4 maximum, but you absolutely do not need that. You can just buy these as is, simply for the gain added chaos damage equal to 10% of our ward. This is what enables all of our damage, so you definitely need them. Then the Yenda's Stand Belt, again, you can catalyze this. It says quality defense modifiers right there. So if you catalyze this, the gain ward instead of 50% of armor and evasion goes up to 60% instead. That's a 20% increase. You see my ward goes from 16,899 to instead just 7,806. So quite a bit of damage from that. You see here, again, 70,000 chaos damage goes down to 32,000. Basically, more than half of our damage from this belt alone. And the final unique item here is the Anathema Ring. This one, the only reason we're using it is your curse limit is equal to your maximum power charges. Again, every character has a maximum of 3 charges. This goes for Frenzy, Endurance, and Power, but we also only normally have a maximum of 1 curse applied to the enemy, which we started with Assassin's Mark. So by running Anathema, we can then run 2 additional curses, right? Because maximum power charge 3, therefore maximum curses 3, which is the entire reason why we're fitting in Despair and Enfeeble. Both of these combined equate to a very large portion of offense and defense respectively. Thankfully, for the rest of the gear, it's pretty much just life, resistances, and spell suppress wherever you can get it. Again, here we have the Searing Exarch and Eater of Worlds implicits, physical damage taken from hits as lightning damage, same thing there. You just want to mitigate fizz as much as possible. The percent reduced mana cost of attacks is also pretty dang important because our mana cost can get quite high. The amulet here has global critical strike multiplier, life, resistances, and then actually that crafted modifier. Non-channeling skills have minus total to mana cost. That obviously further helps our mana cost, just brings it down, 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 down. And the reason why you want your mana costs to be as low as possible is because in pretty much every build of Path of Exile, you're reserving a very large portion of your overall mana. Therefore, if I didn't have this non-channeling skills have minus mana cost, I have it on my ring and my amulet here, as well as the percent reduced mana cost of attacks here, my dual strike would probably cost, 50, 55, even 60 mana. Basically, my entire mana pool would instantly get depleted, and it would just feel terrible. Finally, the last relevant thing on the amulet here is the allocates Sion's Ambition. This I will talk about more when we get to the passive tree. Just know that you can anoint one singular passive skill, no matter where it is on the tree, onto your amulet, and it just gives you the effects of it. But I'll talk about that more in just 1 second. The ring here, again, is just life, resistances, non-channeling mana cost. Also, these golden modifiers here, the max life here on the ring and the all resistances here on the amulet, these are called fractured modifiers, and they simply just cannot be removed. So you can roll the item as much as you want, Chaos Orbs, Exalted Orbs, removing modifiers with Orb of Annulment, whatever you're doing, it will never touch those golden modifiers. So once you understand the crafting system a little bit in Path of Exile, you can make some very good gear, provided that you get a fractured item with a mod that you actually want. Then finally for the boots here, again, life, resistances, spell suppression, and in this case, movement speed. Movement speed is always going to be required on boots, and I have it crafted here because of that mod, chance to gain onslaught on kill for 4 seconds. That is a veiled modifier. You can just run the betrayal mechanic, which is Jun. You'll randomly get boots that drop, unveil them, you'll eventually see this modifier, and you can craft it given your crafting bench. Onslaught is simply a buff that gives you 20% movement speed, cast speed, and attack speed. So an 11% chance on kill means that this is up 24/7 while we are mapping. Feels extremely good. Then for the Eldritch Implicits, which is the drop spittle ground and chance to avoid ailments, you can pretty much do whatever you want in the avoid ailment slot. However, the Searing Exarch Brittle Ground hits have 2% flat critical strike chance against targets on brittle ground. Very powerful. Again, that is your base critical strike chance, so flat 2% is very, 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 very good. Last but not least, quickly covering our flasks. We have a Jade Flask, a Life Flask with Corrupted Blood immunity. I highly recommend that you get Corrupted Blood immunity on your Life Flask specifically, because if you're, popping your life flask, it's usually because, oh shoot, my health bar is almost down, what the heck just happened? And a lot of the time, if you have corrupted blood, that is going to be a very major source of your health bar going down quickly. So, 2 birds with 1 stone. Get a corrupted blood on your life flask. Then a Quicksilver for more movement speed, Granite Flask for more armor, and a Diamond Flask for a little bit more crit. For modifiers on Flask, if you did not know, these do not stack together. They are totally exclusive. So I have movement speed here on this Quicksilver Flask, but if this Granite also had movement speed, for example, they would not stack together. You can only get 1 modifier at a time. So it's important that you have unique affixes on the flasks themselves. So I have 1 movement speed roll, 1 armor roll, 1 evasion roll, and 1 reduced curse effect roll. It doesn't matter where these modifiers are on which flask, it just matters that you have them in general. There are also some other mods you can use, don't get me wrong. These are just the ones that I like running. All right, that is it for our gear and our skills. Let's end the video here. I know it's been a long time, I'm sorry, with our passive tree. I'll try to go through this as quickly as humanly possible. Let's start with our ascendancy class, which again is the Antiquarian. Now, if you're watching this video in the future, I probably should have said this earlier in the video, this class probably will not exist. We're currently in a special event league called the Legacy of Phrecia, where the 19 original ascendancy classes were replaced with 19 half-baked ideas that you had over the years, blah, blah, blah. Basically, the Antiquarian Ascendancy probably does not exist. For the nodes, we're taking a Calgaran armor, again, to get, ward from our body armor. We're getting 100% increased ward from this node with the faster restoration, so ward, again, normally restores after 2 seconds. Now it's only 1 second. We're also getting adrenaline when ward breaks. Again, how ward works is that it's a barrier against your health, but when you take any hit damage, it'll immediately break all of the ward. So you just have to get hit 1 time every 10 seconds, which which is very easy. And you get Adrenaline, which as you can see grants 100% increased damage, 25% attack, cast, and movement speed, and 10% additional physical damage reduction. It is such a stupidly powerful mechanic. And this is up 24/7 while we are mapping. Very, very, very good. For the final node, Lionized Hair, your hits can't be evaded. Simply means you do not need to use accuracy in your build whatsoever. Most attack builds, if you do not invest in any accuracy, are probably sitting around 30% chance to hit something. So yeah, capping your accuracy or just making your hits can't be evaded is extremely powerful. It gives you exponentially more damage. But the downside of 50% reduced dexterity essentially doubles the amount of dexterity that you need to satisfy your gear, which is kind of a problem because if you look at Paradoxica, you need 212 dexterity to use this thing, which means with this node, I would actually need, 424. So to mitigate this downside, the first big thing here, you see the big circle, is we're using the Elegant Hubris Timeless Jewel. Timeless Jewels, you can only have one of them in your build. Long story short, Timeless Jewels simply modify the passives in their radius in some capacity. In this case, Elegant Hubris, specifically commemorated by Caspiro, changes any keystones, this is a keystone, into instead Supreme Ostentation. Normally this thing says Unwavering Stance, cannot evade enemy attacks, cannot be stunned. So we change this over to Supreme Ostentation, which says Ignore Attribute Requirements, aka we can now ignore this 50% reduced dexterity. Very cool. Also, it lets us ignore, stuff like Despair and Enfeeble. These have, a requirement of 155 intelligence. That also is kind of crazy. But the downside of gain no inherent bonuses from attributes, you can see here, strength gets you life and physical damage. Intelligence gives you mana and ES, and dexterity gives you accuracy and evasion. So it's kind of important, but not really. The amount of these stats that we have is pretty negligible in the bonuses that they would be providing. So more or less, that's a very, very, very small downside. Another cool thing is that this jewel doesn't actually modify just this keystone. It modifies everything in this radius. So for in this case, Elegant Hubris specifically, the small passives here do literally nothing. Price of Glory, this literally provides no bonus on your character whatsoever. However, these notable skills here, they can roll with some crazy modifiers. In this case, all of these nodes here are not really useful for me. I mean, I guess like, an extra 50% lightning res would be kind of cool. Accuracy rating would be irrelevant for us because enemies can't evade our hits. So in this case, I have two nodes right here. Purity Rebel, which gives us 12% chance to suppress damage, and Robust Diet gives us 10% increased maximum life. I'm not going to go over how to check which nodes are which because this is based on the seed of the jewel. You can see it says commissioned 98,700 coins to Caspiro. If I hold the Alt key, get ready for this. The range is 2,000 to 160,000. That's quite a bit of seeds for this thing, and that seed will affect, again, anything in its radius. So I'm not going to go over how to roll these things specifically. There are guides out there if you are so inclined to figure it out. And the reason how I can allocate these, you can see I don't actually have my passive points here, and it says right here, can be allocated without being connected to the tree. The reason we're doing this is from this unique jewel over here called Thread of Hope. This basically gives us a variable sized ring. In this case, it is a very large that just rolls like any other mod on the ring, goes from small to very large. And then the -% to all resistances can also roll from -20 to -10. So we have a best in slot with the resistances, very large ring, and that ring, just anything inside of this, I can allocate it without it being connected to my tree. Just saves us a ton of passive points. So this is how we pick up suppression and maximum life, but then this is also how we pick up, much more importantly, Disciple of the Unyielding. This is extraordinarily beneficial for us because we cannot generate endurance charges while we are mapping otherwise. Yes, we could use Enduring Cry, but the radius of Enduring Cry is quite small, and that's how it counts power, and then whatever's in the radius. So it's very situational to have something that's actually strong and give you a lot of power inside of your Enduring Cry radius. And you would have to manually press this, every 8 seconds while you're mapping, which would be super annoying. However, we really want endurance charges while we're mapping, because you can get some very scary enemies. Therefore, Disciple of the Unyielding. 8% chance to gain an endurance charge on kill. Doesn't seem like a lot, but endurance charges by default have a duration of, I think, like 8 seconds or something, or 10 seconds. And when you gain a new charge of any kind, it refreshes the duration of all other charges. So 8% chance, given the amount of monsters that we're killing, it is up absolutely permanently. We also get 8% increased damage per endurance charge, which is kind of nice. And then that +1 minimum endurance charges simply means that no matter what, we always have at least one of these endurance charges. Same thing here with the frenzy charges. This node does the exact same thing, just for frenzy charges. Remember that Blood Rage actually does grant us frenzy charges on kill. So the reason we're using this is not for the on kill mechanic, it's simply for the 8% increased damage per frenzy charge. Just because right here we have +1 frenzy charge, and again on our glove implicit we have +1. So we have a maximum of 5 endurance charges. So this node gives us 40% damage for a single passive point. Kind of hard to beat that. And then for endurance charge, we have the +1 endurance charge here as well. Then for the rest of the tree, I guess I'll keep explaining the complicated mechanics here. We have 2 cluster jewels. Cluster jewels are items that can drop from the Delirium League mechanic, the gray mist mirror thing. And long story short, these things are pretty powerful. powerful, such as with our timeless jewels over here. Unfortunately, there was just way too much information jam-packed into cluster jewels. I'm not going to go over all of it here. All you need to know is that they are an itemized source of passive skills on the tree. You don't need to use these in every build, but the more you play a build, the more you min-max it, the more beneficial these will become for you. In this case, we are simply using these for the passive quick and deadly. 60% increased damage with your main hand, 30% increased attack speed with your offhand. That is stupidly good because remember, dual strike of ambidexterity, more damage with the main hand, offhand weapon attack time. This is for damage, this is for attack speed. This node could not be more perfect for us. The one thing I will say is that you are specifically looking for a cluster jewel with adds 8 passive skills. You can see the enchant, the blue text at the top there. Specifically, you want 8 passives, just so you have to spend less, getting to the passives in the wheel. And you want 3 modifiers, with one of them being quick and deadly. The reason you want 3 is because the first 2 are going to be here, as you can see, with the last one being back here. We ignore this one. We don't care about it. We just want the first 2 right here. Then over here, I have pretty much the same exact thing. Instead of Fuel the Fight, we have Feed the Fury. Feed the Fury is Life Leech, whereas Fuel the Fight is Mana Leech. Preferably, this would also say Feed the Fury. However, crafting a cluster jewel with Feed the Fury, Martial Prowess, and Quick and Deadly is extremely expensive. But more or less, you just want the same 2 cluster jewels. Then, keeping the trend of jewels here, we have a Watcher's Eye with 6% additional physical damage reduction with Determination and 15% chance to suppress spell damage with Grace. I don't think I actually talked about spell suppression. It is an extremely good mechanic. It's really hard to overstate how powerful spell suppression is. You can see here we have a 100% chance to suppress spell damage, and normally what it does is when you suppress spell damage, you reduce its damage by half, or 50%. In this case, it's 53% because of the note. In this case, I have 53% reduction because I have a note up here which says plus 3% prevention of spell suppression. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that suppression is very, 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 very good. What I'm trying to say is that this is a extremely powerful Watcher's Eye. You can see it gives me percent life plus the PDR plus the spell suppression. Very powerful defensively. Then for the rest of the tree, it's pretty much just life and damage. This node here, ambidexterity, is actually the same exact thing as quick and deadly. It gives us 60% damage with the main hand, 30% increased attack speed with the offhand. Then we also have this mastery here, which gives us an additional 60% increased damage. So this cluster alone gives us an extreme amount of damage. Then over here we have this mark cluster. This node right here says Culling Strike against marked enemy. Remember, we're using Assassin's Mark with mark on hit, so anything that we're fighting that is tanky is going to be marked 24/7. Culling Strike, you just kill them when they get to 10% or lower health, so this is essentially 10% more damage. But then the Mastery also gives us 10% chance to gain a Frenzy Charge when you hit your marked enemy. This is very good with Dual Strike because you can see our attack time is 0.4 seconds. If I pop something like Blood Rage, it goes down to 0.36. And then as we generate Frenzy Charges, it's going to go down even further, which means 10% chance to generate a Frenzy Charge on hit. Means permanent uptime Frenzy Charges on anything that is marked, aka bosses or rare enemies that are tanky. Furthermore, this bleed cluster here is so good. You get crit chance for these small nodes here, and then you get critical strike multiplier and critical strike chance against bleeding enemies. 30% multi, 80% crit chance. For reference, here's what generic nodes look like. 25% crit chance, 25% crit chance, 30 crit multi. So for 3 points here, you get 50% increased crit chance and 30 crit multi. 3 points here, you get 30% crit chance plus 80%, so 110% crit chance plus 30% crit multi, but then the Mastery gives you another 80% crit chance. So in total, you get 190% crit chance with 30 crit multi for 4 points. Provided, of course, that the target is bleeding, but remember, you get your bleed chance right here. 20% is way more than enough. So long as they're bleeding, you're getting this bonus. This is like one of, if not the best clusters in the entire game for crit builds. It is absurdly powerful. Then this cluster up here, Thrill of the Battle, gives us 15% reduced mana cost of attacks. The mana per hit is like something, I guess, but it's 2 mana is really nothing. So for these 2 points, we get 23% reduced mana cost of attacks, and then the Mastery, 12% increased mana reservation efficiency of skills. That's a lot of words, simply to say that when you reserve your mana, you reserve less of it. Determination and Grace normally are 50% reservation auras, and then this 1 point here brings them down to 44.6%, meaning if I did not have this point here, you would see my mana goes to literally 0. So it's kind of important to have this Mastery here so we can actually, use our skills. And the final kind of crazy thing on the passive tree here are these Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame jewels. Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame is a combo system which allows you to steal an Ascendancy node from any of the other Ascendancies of your given class. You see it says required class, Marauder. So we get Tukohama, War's Herald, if we have the matching Forbidden Flesh, which we do over here. As you can see here, my Dual Strike of Ambidexterity has 6 icons for support gems, despite only having, 5 links for it. One of the links is Dual Strike of Ambidexterity. So one of these links here is Tukohama, War's Herald. And with this passive does is essentially gives us an Ancestral Call support, but it is level 30. You can see this is a level 1. A level 30 Ancestral Call says supported strike skills target 2 additional nearby enemies, which is very good for our general clearing purposes, but that supported skills deal 19% less damage actually goes up to supported skills deal 10% more damage. Meaning, long story short, 2 jewel sockets equates to 10% more damage and 2 additional targets while we are clearing things. Highly recommend. They're kind of expensive right now, so keep that in mind. The final cluster that is not just life or damage here is this strike cluster here. So the final note here, Treble Fury, strike skills deal splash damage to surrounding targets. This is just nice for clearing purposes, obviously when you get a bunch of monsters grouped up. But then the mastery point, non-vile strike skills target 1 additional nearby enemy. As I just mentioned with Ancestral Call, targeting additional nearby enemies is very, very, very good for your overall clear speed. Furthermore, we support these additional strikes with the Scion's Ambition. Remember, that is the anointment on our amulet. We're finally back over here. It took us a while, I'm sorry. And this thing simply says that when you target additional enemies, you do so from 40% further away. This is simply quality of life for clearing purposes, but honestly, once you use this thing, you cannot go back. I technically, again, can get any other node on this passive tree here, wherever I want it. Even all the way up here, I could anoint something, but the quality of life from Scions is just way, 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 way too good. But yeah, other than that, it's just, percent life. In this case, I was able to take the mastery for 15% increased max life because I have no life modifiers on my body armor here. Highly recommend you try and do that. And then the last thing here would be these tattoos. Remember, we're using Supreme Ostentation, so our attributes literally do not matter, which means we can tattoo pretty much everywhere on our tree should we desire. In this case, I'm using fire resistance tattoos just because I just need to cap my fire res, because it turns out I don't need these anymore. I upgraded my gear at some point. I will keep that in mind. And then down here for these dexterity tattoos, I have 10% chance to avoid being chilled and frozen. Obviously, I have 10 of them, so I have complete chill and freeze immunity. And then up here, just for some quality of life, I have chance to avoid being stunned. I guess I could buy 1 more here and put it there if I really wanted to. It's not that big of a deal though. And the final thing here, I guess, is this leech cluster right here. Now, we don't really need this because again, we have our life leech satisfied right here from Feed the Fury. 0.4% of attack damage leached as life is more than enough. When again, we're hitting for 70,000 chaos damage, but actually no, we're more like hitting for like hundreds of thousands of chaos damage when we crit something. So 0.4% of hundreds of thousands is more than enough to recover our life. But the reason we're taking this cluster is because of this leech mastery. 10% of leech is instant. Notice that this says of leech, not of life leech specifically. So this also applies to our mana leech. All in all, I think this equates to like 30 or 40 flat mana per hit. Remember up here, this was only +2 mana per hit, so quite the sizable difference here with this leech cluster. You don't need this, but it is heavy quality of life. Highly recommend that you take it. All right, and that is absolutely everything about the dual strike, chaos damage, Antiquarian build in the Phrecia League. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. I hope you learned something. I know this was a very long video, but again, the point was to break things down as much as I possibly could. If you need the more concise resource, that is the Path of Building link in the description below. Make sure to check the notes tab out when you're in there. Thank you very much for watching. Check out my stream at twitch.tv/WoolieGaming, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.